Racist cop mocks black woman on trial. A file slides onto the desk. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main characters. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence. The bright, harsh lights from above cast long shadows on the faces of those present. Aisha Williams, a 32-year-old woman with short, curly hair and deep brown eyes, stood at the center of it all. She was dressed in a simple yet elegant outfit, her expression calm, yet a storm raged in her heart. She was not just fighting a case, she was fighting for her dignity. Across from her, seated behind the prosecution's desk, Officer Thomas Richardson, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, sat with a smug look on his face. His light blue uniform, perfectly pressed, seemed to scream authority. He had the look of someone who believed his position made him invincible. His cold blue eyes never once left Aisha as the proceedings began. Richardson was a man who had spent his career on the force, but his reputation was now at stake. The accusations against him were serious, that he had, for years, shown open bias and discrimination towards people of color, particularly African Americans. Yet, here he sat, mocking Aisha without a care in the world. The courtroom was a battleground. On one side, a woman who had suffered injustice, trying to make her voice heard. On the other, a man who had for so long been a part of the very system that oppressed people like her. The judge called the room to order, but the tension was palpable. As Aisha's lawyer began laying out the facts of her case, Officer Richardson couldn't resist the urge to make subtle, mocking comments. His body language was relaxed, almost as if he were enjoying the discomfort he was causing Aisha. Every word that came out of his mouth felt like a dig. Aisha could feel the sting of each remark, but she held her ground. She wasn't there to let him tear her down. She was there to prove that she deserved to be heard, just like anyone else in that room. Aisha's heart pounded as her lawyer continued presenting the evidence against Richardson. But in that moment, something changed. As the lawyer spoke, a file was pushed across the desk in front of the judge, a thick, manila folder that slid with a soft noise. The room fell silent for a brief second, as everyone's attention turned to the file. The atmosphere shifted. Richardson's smile faltered, and his posture became tense. He knew what was coming. The file contained documents that would expose the truth about his past actions, evidence that would prove that Aisha's case was not just an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of misconduct. The sound of the file sliding across the desk seemed to echo in the room, signaling the beginning of the end for Officer Richardson. The judge, a middle-aged man with glasses and a stern expression, flipped open the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. As he read, the weight of the situation became clear to everyone present. Aisha, despite the emotional toll of the moment, allowed herself a small, quiet breath of relief. She knew that this was the turning point. It was no longer just her word against his. The truth was finally on her side. The judge, still holding the file in his hands, scanned the documents carefully. The silence in the courtroom grew heavier, the only sound being the rustling of pages as the judge read. Aisha's lawyer, a young woman named Jennifer Park, stood with her arms crossed, watching intently, her expression unreadable. She knew this was the moment. She had prepared for it, but there was still a part of her that was holding her breath. Officer Richardson shifted uneasily in his seat, his usual smug demeanor now faltering. His jaw clenched tightly as he stared at the judge, trying to maintain his composure. The atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. The power dynamic had changed. The file that had slid across the desk had revealed something that could not be ignored. The evidence inside was damning. Aisha, despite the turmoil she had endured, felt a glimmer of hope. She had come into this trial with nothing but her truth, and now the truth was speaking for her. It was no longer just her word against his. Richardson's past actions, detailed in the file, were about to be exposed to the world. The judge finally placed the file down on the desk, looking up at Richardson with a stern expression. "Officer Richardson," the judge began, his voice calm but firm, "I have read through the evidence presented here. It appears there are serious concerns about your conduct during previous incidents." Richardson's face turned pale, his eyes narrowing in response. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time, he seemed to be at a loss for words. Aisha's heart raced as she watched the scene unfold before her. She had no illusions about the challenges she still faced, but this moment felt like a victory in itself. The truth was finally coming to light. The judge turned his attention to Aisha. "Ms. Williams, I want to thank you for your courage in bringing this case to light. The evidence you have presented today, combined with the witness testimonies, has provided a clear picture of the events leading up to this trial." Aisha nodded silently, her hands clasped together in front of her. She didn't need the judge's words to know that this battle wasn't over. But hearing them made her feel, for the first time, that she wasn't alone in this fight. Richardson, however, still wasn't ready to give up. He straightened in his chair, trying to regain some of his lost composure. "This is all just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "These accusations are baseless. I have served my community for over 20 years, and now you're accusing me of such things?" His words, though desperate, didn't hold the same weight they once did. The judge didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at Aisha's lawyer, Jennifer, who stood with a slight, knowing smile on her face. Jennifer knew they had won. The evidence was undeniable. Richardson had no way to explain it away. "We will adjourn for today," the judge finally said, his tone decisive. "This court will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m. to discuss the next steps. Officer Richardson, I suggest you prepare yourself for the upcoming proceedings." Aisha felt a sense of relief wash over her. It wasn't the final victory, but it was a significant step forward. As the courtroom began to empty, she allowed herself a quiet moment of peace. She had come here to fight for her dignity, for the truth, and today, she had taken one step closer to that goal. The battle was far from over, but the tide had shifted in her favor. She knew that, no matter what happened next, she had already won. Richardson, on the other hand, seemed to have lost his earlier confidence. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was ashen. The weight of the evidence against him was beginning to sink in. The courtroom doors swung open, and Aisha walked out, her head held high. She didn't look back, but she knew the journey was far from finished. But today, she had won a small but crucial victory, and that was enough for now. The next morning, the courtroom once again filled with a quiet tension as the proceedings resumed. Aisha entered with the same calm determination she had shown the day before, but today there was something different in the air. The weight of the previous day's revelations still hung heavy over Officer Richardson, and it was clear that the truth was beginning to settle in. Aisha's lawyer, Jennifer Park, had a quiet confidence as she prepared for the next phase of the trial. Today wasn't just about proving a point. It was about ensuring that justice was served. The judge called the session to order, his voice steady and firm as he addressed the room. "This court will now hear the final statements before proceeding to a ruling," he said, looking over at both the defense and the prosecution. Richardson, still trying to maintain his composure, sat rigidly in his chair. His once confident posture had been replaced by a tense stiffness, as if he was waiting for the next blow to fall. Aisha, however, stood tall. She had been through the ringer, but now she knew that the truth was on her side. She felt a quiet pride in herself, a quiet strength that came from knowing she had fought for what was right. Richardson's lawyer spoke first, a man in his early 50s named Mark Jensen. He was well-versed in the art of defense, a veteran of many courtroom battles. "Your Honor," he began, "while we acknowledge the presence of the file in question, it must be noted that these allegations against Officer Richardson are, at best, unsubstantiated. There is no concrete evidence linking my client to any criminal wrongdoing. The case against him is based purely on conjecture and hearsay." Jennifer Park stood up, her voice clear and unwavering as she responded. With all due respect, Mr. Jensen, the evidence presented here yesterday speaks for itself. Officer Richardson's actions have been documented, and these aren't just random accusations. They are the culmination of years of bias and discrimination that cannot and should not be ignored. Aisha Williams is not the only one who has been affected by this officer's actions, but she is the one who has chosen to stand up and speak out. Aisha felt a rush of emotion as Jennifer spoke, her words hitting a chord deep within her. She had always known that she wasn't the only one suffering from systemic injustice, but to hear it spoken aloud in the courtroom made everything feel more real. It was no longer just about her. It was about all the others who had been silenced, all the others who had been ignored. The judge nodded thoughtfully, taking in Jennifer's words. "You make a compelling argument, Ms. Park," he said, before turning his attention to Richardson. "Officer Richardson, do you have anything further to add?" Richardson swallowed hard, his throat tight as he stood up to speak. He looked out at the courtroom, his eyes meeting Aisha's for the first time since the trial began. There was no smugness left in his expression, only a fleeting moment of vulnerability. I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I never meant to hurt anyone. I've been a police officer for over 20 years, and I've always believed in serving my community. I never wanted to be the kind of person who discriminates." His words hung in the air, but they felt hollow. Aisha could see the cracks in his facade, the cracks in the story he had spent so many years telling himself. It was clear to her now that this wasn't just about the one incident that had brought them here. It was about the years of unchecked behavior that had led to this moment. The judge sat silently for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he processed everything that had been said. Finally, he spoke. "I believe this court has heard enough. The evidence is clear, and Officer Richardson's actions have caused harm. It is time to make a decision." The gavel struck down with a decisive thud, and the room fell into an expectant silence. Aisha's heart raced, her palms sweating, but there was no turning back now. She had made it this far. She had fought for justice, and she knew that, no matter what the outcome, she had given everything. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "The court will adjourn for today. We will reconvene tomorrow to announce the final ruling." As the proceedings ended, Aisha felt a mix of relief and anticipation. She had done everything she could, and now all she could do was wait. The truth had been laid bare, and no matter what happened next, she knew that this was a victory she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The following day, the courtroom was filled once again with a hushed tension as everyone awaited the final ruling. Aisha sat quietly in the front row, her heart pounding as the time for the judge's decision approached. The room seemed smaller now, with the weight of the past few days lingering heavily in the air. Officer Richardson, sitting across the room, looked different today. The confident demeanor that had once defined him had completely evaporated. His eyes were red-rimmed, and there was a faint tremble in his hands as he nervously fidgeted with a pen. Aisha noticed, but she didn't take satisfaction in his discomfort. For her, this wasn't about watching someone squirm. It was about finally getting the justice she deserved. Jennifer Park, standing beside Aisha, gave her a reassuring nod, a silent reminder that they had fought hard and had nothing to regret. She had prepared Aisha for whatever came next, knowing full well that the weight of the decision would fall on the judge's shoulders. The judge entered the room, and a quiet silence fell over the courtroom as everyone stood. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and began. After carefully reviewing all evidence and testimonies presented, including the detailed file submitted by the prosecution, I have come to a decision in the case of Aisha Williams versus Officer Thomas Richardson. The judge paused, his gaze sweeping across the courtroom. Aisha's pulse quickened. The air felt thick with anticipation. It is clear to this court that Officer Richardson's conduct throughout his career has displayed a pattern of discriminatory actions and bias against African American individuals. The evidence presented by the prosecution was not only substantial but irrefutable. This pattern of behavior cannot be ignored, and the harm caused by it is undeniable. Aisha felt a lump in her throat as she heard those words. The truth, her truth, was finally being recognized. The years of pain, of being dismissed, of fighting alone, none of it was in vain. She had made it. The judge's voice continued. Therefore, based on the evidence and the testimonies of witnesses, I find Officer Richardson guilty of misconduct and violation of the civil rights of multiple individuals, including Ms. Williams. This court orders that he be suspended from active duty, and further investigations will be conducted regarding his past actions. He will face a formal hearing to determine the appropriate disciplinary measures. Richardson's face drained of color as the judge's words sank in. He was no longer the powerful figure he had once been. He was just another man facing the consequences of his actions. He stood up slowly, looking around the courtroom as if trying to process what had just been said. Aisha, for the first time, felt a sense of vindication wash over her. It wasn't just the ruling, it was the knowledge that she had been heard, that her voice had made a difference. The courtroom erupted in a mix of muted gasps and quiet murmurs. Aisha's lawyer, Jennifer, smiled subtly, her professional demeanor never wavering. She knew that this ruling was just the beginning of a much larger conversation about accountability and justice. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, the judge addressed the room one last time. "This court is adjourned," he declared. The words felt like a weight lifting from Aisha's shoulders. She had come here to fight for her dignity, and she had succeeded. The battle wasn't over, but this moment, this victory, was hers. As Aisha stood up and left the courtroom, she felt a surge of emotion. She had been through so much. There had been days when she had doubted herself, when the pressure had felt too great. But today, as she stepped outside the courtroom into the bright light of day, she felt stronger than she ever had before. She had fought for justice and had won, and she knew that her courage would inspire others to do the same. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind for Aisha. The ruling in her favor had been a significant moment, not just for her, but for the many others who had silently endured the same kind of injustice. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, Aisha's name was making headlines. She had become a symbol of strength, of the power of standing up for what was right. Yet, despite the praise and the attention, Aisha couldn't help but feel conflicted. She had achieved what she set out to do, hold Officer Richardson accountable for his actions, but the journey had taken a toll on her. It was exhausting, emotionally draining, and she found herself needing time to process everything that had happened. At home, she sat quietly on the couch one evening, the weight of it all settling in. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Jennifer Park, her lawyer, and now a trusted ally. "Aisha," Jennifer's voice was warm but serious. "I just wanted to check in on you. How are you holding up?" Aisha smiled softly, grateful for the call. "I'm doing okay," she replied. "It's been a lot, though. I feel like everything has changed, but I'm not sure where to go from here." "I understand," Jennifer said. "The fight is far from over, but you've done something incredible. You've given a voice to so many others who didn't have one." Aisha took a deep breath. "I know, but it's hard not to feel overwhelmed by it all. I never imagined it would get this big. It feels like I've stepped into something I can't fully control." Jennifer paused before responding. "That's completely normal. But remember, you're not in this alone. You've inspired so many people, and you've started a conversation that needed to be had. The work doesn't stop here, Aisha. There are still so many more who need justice." Aisha thought about her words. It was true. This case, while personal, was part of something much bigger. It was about the systemic issues that had long plagued the country. And now, Aisha was not just a victim. She was a catalyst for change. "I just don't want to lose myself in all of this," Aisha said quietly. "I've fought for so long to be seen, to be heard. But now that I have a voice, I don't want to forget what I'm really fighting for." "You won't," Jennifer reassured her. "This is your fight, Aisha, but it's also your journey. Take the time you need to heal, to find balance. And when you're ready, we'll keep moving forward together." The conversation ended with a sense of peace settling over Aisha. She was reminded that while the road ahead would be long and challenging, she wasn't alone. The case had brought her into a larger fight for justice, but it had also reminded her of the importance of self-care and finding strength within herself. Over the next few months, Aisha focused on her own healing. She spoke at community events, sharing her story and advocating for change. She met with others who had been through similar experiences, finding solidarity in their shared struggles. The work was hard, and there were days when she felt like giving up, but each time she looked back on what she had already accomplished, she found renewed strength. Officer Richardson's suspension was just the beginning. The real work was in changing the system, in ensuring that no one else would have to endure the same kind of discrimination. Aisha knew the road ahead would be challenging, but she was no longer afraid. She had taken the first step toward change, and now she was determined to see it through. And as she moved forward, she did so with a sense of pride, knowing that she was no longer just a victim of injustice. She was a warrior for change. As the months passed, Aisha continued to advocate for change, speaking at events and engaging with communities. Her voice had become a beacon for those who had been marginalized, those who had been ignored, and those who had suffered in silence. The momentum from her victory against Officer Richardson was only the beginning. She was driven by a deep sense of purpose, fueled by the belief that true change could only come if the system itself was reformed. Aisha's life had shifted in ways she never imagined. What had started as a personal fight had evolved into a larger movement. She had become an advocate for racial justice, a powerful voice calling for accountability and transparency in law enforcement. But as much as she had accomplished, there were still challenges ahead. One evening, after a long day of speaking with local community leaders, Aisha sat at her kitchen table, reflecting on how far she had come. There were days when the weight of her responsibilities felt overwhelming. She thought about the personal cost of all this, the time spent away from family, the emotional toll of reliving painful experiences, and the constant pressure of living in the public eye. Yet, through it all, Aisha had remained steadfast. She had found strength in the support of others who shared her vision, and she had learned to rely on her inner resilience. That evening, Jennifer Parr called again. "How are you holding up?" Jennifer asked, her voice filled with genuine concern. "It's been a lot lately," Aisha admitted, her voice tired but resolute. "But I know it's worth it. Every conversation I have, every story I hear, it strengthens my resolve to keep going." Jennifer paused, allowing Aisha a moment of reflection. "You're doing incredible work, Aisha, and I know the road ahead isn't easy, but you're not alone in this fight." Aisha smiled softly. "I've learned that, more than anything, I'm not in this alone. There's a whole community of people standing with me." After the call ended, Aisha stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city. The streets were busy, but there was a sense of peace in the air. She knew that change wouldn't come overnight. But each day, she was making a difference, no matter how small. And that was enough to keep her going. Weeks later, Aisha was invited to a national conference on police reform, where she would join a panel of experts, activists, and policymakers to discuss the future of law enforcement. It was a huge opportunity, one that would put her at the forefront of the conversation on racial justice. As she prepared for the event, Aisha felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was a significant moment, a chance to have her voice heard on a national stage. When the day arrived, Aisha walked onto the stage with the same confidence she had found in herself over the past months. She stood in front of an audience of hundreds, all eager to hear her perspective. The panel began, and one by one, experts shared their views on how to address systemic issues within law enforcement. When it was Aisha's turn to speak, she took a deep breath and began. "We cannot talk about police reform without acknowledging the deep-rooted issues of racism that have been embedded in law enforcement for generations," she said, her voice steady and strong. "This is not just about one officer, one incident, or one case. This is about a system that has failed too many for too long. And it's time for that system to change." Her words rang out in the room, and Aisha could feel the weight of them as they settled into the minds of everyone listening. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been treated unjustly. When the panel ended, Aisha was approached by several journalists eager to hear more. But as she walked away from the stage, she knew that this was only the beginning of an even bigger journey. She had started something that could no longer be stopped. And with each step she took, she felt more empowered, more certain that the work she was doing mattered. The road ahead would be long, and there would be moments of doubt, but Aisha knew one thing for sure. She was ready to face whatever came next. Aisha's journey continued to unfold in unexpected ways. The momentum from the national conference had sparked even more discussions about police reform, and her efforts had reached new heights. She was invited to join multiple activist groups and nonprofit organizations, each eager to tap into her experience and advocacy. But despite the growing platform, Aisha remained grounded. She focused on the core of her mission, the fight for justice and equality. A few weeks after the conference, Aisha sat down with a group of young activists from a local community center. They were a diverse group, ranging in age from teenagers to young adults, all passionate about making a difference. The room was filled with a sense of purpose, and Aisha couldn't help but feel inspired by their energy. As they discussed strategies for addressing racial inequality, Aisha shared her own story, recounting the challenges she had faced and the lessons she had learned. "When I first spoke out, I had no idea where it would lead," she told them. "I just knew that something had to change, and I couldn't stay silent any longer. But the real power comes from all of us coming together, supporting each other, and holding those in power accountable." The young activists listened intently, their eyes bright with hope. One of them, a 19-year-old woman named Jasmine, spoke up. "How do we keep going when it feels like nothing changes?" she asked, her voice tinged with frustration. Aisha looked at her, understanding the weight of the question. "Change doesn't always happen overnight," she said gently. "But every action we take, every voice we raise, is a step forward. It may seem small, but it adds up. And when enough people speak out, when enough people demand justice, that's when the real change begins." The conversation shifted to practical steps they could take, from organizing local rallies to educating their communities about their rights. Aisha felt a sense of pride watching these young people find their own path in the fight for justice. She had never intended to become a leader, but as the weeks turned into months, she realized that her voice and her story had given others the courage to speak up as well. One afternoon, Aisha received a phone call from a reporter who had been following her work. The journalist asked for her thoughts on the recent wave of protests across the country, sparked by police brutality incidents in other cities. Aisha took a deep breath before responding. "The protests we're seeing are a direct result of the systemic racism that has been allowed to persist for far too long," she said. "People are angry, and they have every right to be. We've seen too many lives lost, too many families destroyed. It's time for this to stop." Her words resonated with the journalist, and the article that followed reached even more readers, amplifying her message. Aisha knew that the journey was far from over. There were still battles to be fought, injustices to be corrected, and systems to be rebuilt. But as she stood in front of a crowd at another community event a few weeks later, she felt a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in a long time. The room was full of people who believed in the same vision of justice and equality. Aisha had become a part of something much larger than herself, a movement that would continue long after she was gone. As she spoke to the crowd, her voice steady and confident, she realized that she had come full circle. The quiet woman who had once fought alone in a courtroom had become a leader, an advocate, and a symbol of the power of persistence. Aisha's heart swelled with pride as she looked out at the faces in the crowd. This was her purpose, and she would continue to fight for it, no matter the cost. Her journey had only just begun. Aisha's efforts began to gain more attention as her message reached further across the country. She had become a symbol of resilience, a beacon for those who believed in justice and equality. With each passing day, she found herself more involved in discussions about systemic reform. Aisha's story had given her the platform to speak out, but it was the countless other stories of injustice that kept her moving forward. One day, she received an invitation to attend a meeting with a group of lawmakers who were discussing potential changes to police practices and accountability. It was a huge opportunity, one that could lead to tangible change on a national level. She knew that speaking in front of these policymakers would be a challenge, but she also knew that it was an opportunity she couldn't afford to pass up. On the day of the meeting, Aisha arrived at the legislative building, the weight of the moment settling over her. She had walked into countless rooms before, but this one felt different. The men and women seated around the table represented the very system that had failed so many, but now they were listening to her. As she sat down, she felt the eyes of the room on her. She was ready, not just for herself, but for the many who couldn't speak out, the many who had been silenced for so long. The conversation started slowly, with the lawmakers discussing their proposed reforms. Aisha listened carefully, her mind working through the implications of each idea. But she knew that their plans would mean nothing without true accountability. Finally, she was called upon to speak. She stood, feeling the weight of the moment on her shoulders, but her voice was steady as she addressed the room. "The time for change is now," Aisha said. "We've spent too many years ignoring the voices of those who have been hurt. We've spent too many years pretending that the system is working when we all know it's not. Reform is not enough. What we need is accountability. We need a system that holds people responsible for their actions, no matter who they are or what position they hold." Her words were direct, but they carried the force of everything she had fought for. She spoke not just for herself, but for everyone who had been treated unfairly, everyone who had been left behind. "You cannot fix what you refuse to see," Aisha continued. "We cannot have meaningful change until we confront the racism, the bias, and the corruption that runs through our institutions. This isn't just a problem for one city or one department. This is a nationwide issue that affects every single one of us." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Aisha could see the uncertainty in the faces around her, but she also saw something else, a shift. The conversation had changed. She had planted a seed, and she could only hope it would take root. After her speech, the lawmakers began to engage with her ideas more seriously. There were discussions, questions, and debates, but they were different now. The focus had shifted from abstract policies to real, actionable change. Aisha left the meeting feeling a mixture of exhaustion and hope. It was just one conversation, but it felt like a breakthrough. As she walked out of the building and into the fresh air, she realized that the fight was far from over. But in that moment, she knew that her voice had made an impact, and that impact would ripple outward, sparking more conversations, more changes, and more victories. She had started a movement, and no matter how long it took, she was determined to see it through. Aisha knew the road ahead would be difficult, but with each step, she felt more powerful, more certain that she was on the right path. The battle for justice was long, but with her courage and the support of so many others, it was a battle she knew she could win. Aisha's continued journey was marked by both small victories and tough challenges. The conversation she had sparked in the legislative meeting began to gain momentum, but the road ahead was still fraught with obstacles. She had learned that true change was never easy, and the deeper she delved into the fight for justice, the more she realized just how deeply ingrained the systems of inequality were. In the following months, Aisha was approached by several organizations working on police reform, as well as those focused on addressing the root causes of racial injustice in the country. She became a central figure in these conversations, helping to bridge the gap between activists, policymakers, and the communities directly impacted by discrimination. But despite her newfound position of influence, Aisha never lost sight of her original purpose. She still made time to visit the communities that had supported her from the beginning, to speak with young people who were just starting their own fights for justice. She knew the importance of keeping the dialogue grounded in the real-world struggles of those who had experienced the brunt of systemic racism firsthand. One afternoon, Aisha was invited to a town hall meeting in a small neighborhood on the outskirts of a major city. The event was intended to bring together local residents, community leaders, and law enforcement officers in the hopes of opening up a conversation about accountability and trust. It was a challenge Aisha had taken on willingly, But she knew that getting these two groups to listen to each other was no easy feat. As she entered the room, she was greeted with a mix of faces, some curious, some skeptical, and some outright hostile. She had been in similar situations before, but this time felt different. The stakes were higher, and the room was tense. The town hall started with brief introductions, but it was clear from the beginning that people were eager to speak their minds. The first few speakers shared their concerns, mostly focused on the deep mistrust between the community and the police. As Aisha listened, she could feel the weight of their words. These are the stories of real people, people who had been ignored or silenced for too long. When it was her turn to speak, Aisha stood up and took a deep breath. "I understand the pain that so many of you feel," she began. "I know what it's like to be on the receiving end of a system that doesn't protect you, that doesn't care about you. I've been there, and I've fought for my own justice. But I want you to know that there is power in coming together, in having these hard conversations. We can't change what's happened, but we can change the future." Her words were met with silence at first, but as she spoke, a shift began to take place. The anger in the room wasn't gone, but it was tempered with a sense of cautious hope. Aisha wasn't offering easy solutions or empty promises. She was offering something much more valuable, the promise of a new kind of dialogue, one where everyone's voice was heard. As the meeting continued, Aisha facilitated a series of smaller group discussions. She encouraged the officers and the community members to speak openly with one another, to share their stories, and to find common ground. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, moments where the walls seemed impenetrable. But there were also moments of real connection when people began to listen, truly listen to one another. By the end of the night, there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. The town hall hadn't solved all of the problems, but it had opened a door to a future where understanding and empathy could begin to replace anger and mistrust. Aisha knew that this was only the beginning. The work was far from finished, but she could see the spark of change flickering in the hearts of the people who had attended that meeting. They had taken the first step, and Aisha was there to help guide them forward. As she left the town hall that evening, she felt a sense of fulfillment. It wasn't just about the victories on the national stage, the speeches, or the media attention. It was about these moments, the quiet ones, the real conversations that would shape the future. She had started a movement, but the real work was in these small, everyday moments when people came together to build trust and create lasting change.